And this is really going to be our topic for the rest of the semester. So we're going to look at various aspects of ecology. And before we begin looking at the details of ecology, I want to go back to something that we talked about back in chapter 1 of Biology 105. Remember that when we study biology, there's a whole hierarchy of levels that we can study biology at. We can study biology at the atomic level or the molecular level. At the atomic level, we don't usually study biology. Usually that's a matter for chemistry and physics, but occasionally we do. Keep in mind that atoms and molecules, even molecules like DNA, are not alive in and of themselves, even though they're very important. And even though I never stop talking about proteins, proteins are not alive by themselves. We have to combine molecules. We have to use these molecules to build something called a cell. A cell is the smallest living organism. Now, groups of similar cells, if we look at a multicellular organism, an organism whose body is made of many cells, groups of similar cells form tissues. So this is what we've been talking about recently with plants. Parenchyma tissue, parenchyma, sclerenchyma, xylem, phloem, epidermis, things like that. And at least in a few organisms, some of the fungi, plants, and animals, tissues can combine to make up organs. So they're looking at an elephant as an example, and actually every bone in your body is a separate organ. So is every muscle in your body. Every skeletal muscle, I should qualify that. In animals, organs work together to form what we call organ systems or body systems. Now notice, even though plants have organs, we don't usually think of all the leaves as making an organ system or all the roots as making the root system. In the fungi that have stolons and rhizoids and different types of hyphae, we don't think of those as organizing into organ systems. Now you can take all the body systems if you're looking at an animal, or all the organs if you're looking at a plant or a fungus, or just all the cells if you're looking at something like, say, a small type of plant like a moss, where we don't really have distinct organs typically, but we can make an organism. And keep in mind, an organism is generally defined as something that can carry out the functions of living organisms by itself. Even though that's how organisms are defined, that definition is a little bit deceptive. Because for living organisms, there are two things that they often can't do by themselves. You are a living organism, but like a lot of living organisms, you need a partner to reproduce. Some organisms can reproduce by themselves, but many organisms do need a partner to reproduce. And when we talk about evolution, think about our discussion back towards the beginning of the semester. We didn't just look at Punnett squares, we looked at gene pools. We looked at the Hardy-Weinberg equation. Individuals don't evolve. You can go to the gym, you can work out and get bigger muscles, you can read books, you can get smarter. That's not evolution. Populations evolve, individuals don't evolve. So back in 105, we concentrated really on the levels of biology that could be studied up to about the organ level. In this class, if you think back to evolution, we started with populations, and for the last part of the class, as we're studying ecology, when we think of ecology, we typically say that ecology studies the interaction or the relationship between organisms and their environment. So we really start at the organism level and we work our way up. So when we're talking about ecology, we're not usually focusing on cells or biochemistry or individual organs. So let's think about some of these levels, and let's look at this a little bit differently. This is sometimes called the biological hierarchy. Let's look at basically the same diagram, but let's think of it in terms of the ecological hierarchy. And if we look at the ecological hierarchy, we typically think of starting with an individual organism. So we've got our elephant down here. Now notice it could be a multicellular organism like an elephant, but it could be an individual organism that's much smaller. It could be a mouse. It could be a small bush. It could be a single cell, because if we're talking about a bacteria or some protista or a yeast, one individual cell is one organism. Now, in most cases, we can't really do much by studying an individual organism, since ecology is the study of organisms and their environment. And it might seem like if we're just looking at one individual organism that it never makes sense to talk about an individual organism in terms of ecology. But if we look at people, people are a good example. Most estimates that I've read recently suggest that a typical human has about 37 trillion cells in their body. 37 trillion. So that's a lot of cells. But it's also estimated that a typical person has about 4 times that many bacteria cells in and on their body. You know, and keep in mind, washing your hands more frequently is not going to get rid of these bacteria. A lot of them are internal, and a lot of them are living in your mouth, so that when you speak like I am now, you're kind of putting bacteria all over the place. So if you look at a large multicellular organism like a person, keep in mind, people are bigger than 99% of all living things. We tend to focus on the ones that are larger than us, but we're really pretty big. We are the environment for a lot of microscopic organisms. Not only do you have tons of bacteria living in and on you, most people, I would say all, but there's probably somebody out there that's an exception to the rule. Almost all people have dust mites. And dust mites actually feed on dead skin cells. And since a typical person loses several million skin cells every day, they have a lot to feed on. So some of these dust mites might be in the dust bunnies hiding underneath your couch, but some of these dust mites actually live on your skin. Now keep in mind, they're so small you can't actually feel them. So don't all of a sudden start to feel itchy. About a third of all people, or a fourth of all people, the estimates vary, actually have little mites that, you know, if you look at your eyelashes, you can see a little hole where the eyelash goes into the eyelid. About a third or a fourth of all people have little mites that live in those little holes where the eyelashes go into the eyelids, and they crawl out and they eat dead skin off your eyelids. And again, they're so small you can't feel them, so don't start itching like crazy. That's not going to get rid of them. Now, when we study ecology, unless we're studying a large organism, such as a person, and we could do the same thing with, say, an elephant or an oak tree, or, you know, something big enough for other cells to live in and on. Unless we're studying a relatively large organism, we don't talk about organisms when we talk about ecology. Instead, we talk about a group of organisms, a population. And a few minutes ago, I said individuals don't evolve, populations evolve. So usually when we start studying ecology, population is the level where we start. And a population is all the individual organisms of one species. So all the Homo sapiens, or all the gorilla, or all the pan troglodytes, or whatever type of organism we happen to be looking at, it's all the individuals of that species that live in a local area. Now remember what we talked about a little bit with evolution. How big is this local area? Well, the size of this local area really depends on how mobile this type of organism is. If you're looking at birds, which can fly, a population can cover a wide area. If you're looking at turtles, which, don't move very quickly, a population is probably a pretty small area, unless they're turtles that can get in water and swim to a new area easily. So when we look at populations, it's all the organisms of one particular species. So that's it, whether it's Homo sapiens, but if we're looking at a population of Homo sapiens and we're looking at the population, we're not thinking about the dust mites that might live on their skin or the E. coli that might live in their digestive system. We're just thinking about the Homo sapiens. We might bring these other organisms into the picture, but if we bring other organisms into the picture, we're really looking at ecology at what is called the community level. And the community level is all the populations of all the species in one local area. So when we say all the populations of all the species, if we're talking about humans, then we have to talk about the E. coli and the lactobacillus and the other bacteria that live in our digestive systems. We have to talk about the dust mites that live on our skin. We have to talk about cockroaches and mice and rats. Oh, and dogs and cats and birds, things that we keep as pets, and all the pigeons that you see on the streets downtown, and all the nematodes that live in the soil in our backyard. So we have to talk about all these living organisms when we're talking about a community. And again, we're talking about all the populations of all the species that live in a local area. And again, how local? Local enough they can interact. Now notice it doesn't mean that they interact directly. You might not interact with rats directly, but rats do carry fleas, and the fleas carry bacteria, and the bacteria can transmit something called the bubonic plague or the Black Death to people. So in a very indirect way, you might be able to interact with rats. Most people probably do not have rats for pets, but there are some people who do have rats for pets. Not the same types of rats you might find in the alley, but so when we look at a community, we're looking at all these populations. What we generally focus on is how do these populations interact? And some of these interactions are things that you've seen if you've ever watched any type of nature show. Probably the most famous type of interaction is something called predation. In predation, one type of animal eats another type of animal. That's how we usually think of it. But you could also think of predation as one type of protistan eating another type of protistan. And if they're protista, none of them are really animals. So in a broader sense, predation is one organism eating another one for lunch. From that point of view, you could think of a very specific type of predation as being parasitism, because a parasite literally eats part of its host. Or you could think of another type of predation as being herbivory, where a cow eats grass. It's preying on that grass. We usually don't think of that as predator-prey, because when we think of predator-prey, we think of animals. But again, we have to keep in mind, we have a little bit of a kind of a biased outlook on things. Now, besides predation, there's something called competition. So we talked about competition very indirectly back when we talked about Darwin. Competition refers to organisms that have to use the same resources. And keep in mind that when we look at competition, it's not usually direct competition. It's not like two football teams playing each other. Competition usually depends on which organism has a better sense of smell, so it can detect food better, or which organism can hide from predators better. So this includes things like predation, competition, and it also includes organisms working together. There's one type of interaction called mutualism, where both organisms benefit from the association. So when we think about communities, we're going to be looking at interactions between different types of species. And what we're going to focus on is how do these interactions affect the population? And in terms of the population, there's usually two things that we study. We either study their distribution, where do you find them, or we study their numbers. So if we have predation, for instance, if we have wolves eating deers, the wolves obviously get some nutrition from this. So this form of predation would be something that would increase the size of the wolf population and would decrease the size of the deer population. And if we have something like predation or competition that's severe enough, you might even restrict where an organism is found. We'll see some examples of that. Now notice that if we're studying a population or a community, this is in a way what you would expect in biology, because if we're studying a population or a community, we're studying living organisms, period. In a population or a community study of ecology, we don't look at anything that isn't alive. But for these last three levels, when we look at an ecosystem or a biome or a biosphere, one of the things that we do is not only are we looking at living organisms, but we're also looking at their non-living environment. So let's think first about an ecosystem. And the easiest way to think about an ecosystem is to think about the community that we just mentioned. We said a community is all the populations of all the different species living in one local area. An ecosystem is just all the populations of all the local species living in one area, along with their physical environment. So not just the living organisms, but what type of nutrients are found in the soil? What's the weather like in this area? How much rainfall does it get? Is the rainfall spread out evenly over the year, or are there wet seasons and dry seasons? What about the temperature? Do we have hot summers and cold winters, or is it kind of mild spring-like weather all year around? So we're looking at physical factors when we think about the ecosystem. And it's sometimes hard for us to admit as biologists, but notice when we study ecology, in many cases, the physical factors turn out to be more important than the biological factors. You know, if you think about plants, if you go up to the Arctic area or if you go down to Antarctica, we don't have plants growing. Why? Well, because it's too cold, it's too dry, all the water is tied up as ice or snow. So because of the physical conditions, it has an effect on the living organisms that are found there. On the other hand, living organisms can also affect their environment. It's pretty obvious with people. We hear all the time about environmental problems that people cause, but in some places in Africa, there have been problems when they've set aside game reserves for elephants, because elephants are one of the animals that can damage their ecosystem just as severely as people can. A lot of times when they want to get leaves from trees, if the stem of the tree is slanted slightly, elephants just kind of lean on the stem and they break the tree trunk. And now the top leaves are down where they can reach them very easily. So there have been some ecosystems in Africa where elephants have kind of destroyed the ecosystem. Now you might think, why don't elephants do this normally? Why isn't Africa devastated? Because normally elephants travel and they migrate across Africa. But with modern national boundaries and with elephants being confined to some national parks, they can't always migrate now. And when they're confined to one area, that's when they tend to damage the environment. Now, a lot of studies of ecology have kind of thrown out the biome. We have it listed in here, but our book mostly lumps the biome with the ecosystem. So if we think about an ecosystem, remember, is an area where all the populations can interact. When we talk about biomes, biomes are often defined as the major biological divisions of the earth. When we talk about biomes, we can think about biomes in two different ways. You can think about a biome in very general terms, like deserts. So what's the main characteristic of deserts? They're relatively dry. They don't get a lot of precipitation. Now notice, as we'll see when we talk about biomes later, a lot of what we think about when we look at ecology, just like with other aspects of biology that we've discussed this semester, a lot of aspects of our thought about biomes is really kind of warped. In this case, not by our perspective in being a human, well, maybe it is in a way, but by our perspective in movies that we've watched. So if I ask you what you think about with deserts, most people would say hot weather, sand, not much rain. Not much rain is right, but actually worldwide, if we look at deserts, as much of the ground is covered with bare rock as is covered with sand. But we don't necessarily think about that when we think about a desert. And there are some cold deserts, like the desert in Mongolia, where the temperature is relatively low most of the year. But what do all these deserts have in common? Not much precipitation. Now, besides deserts, we'll also talk about some biomes like the tropical rainforest and the tundra and the temperate grassland and the temperate deciduous forest. The temperate grassland and the temperate deciduous forest are both found in Illinois. We're kind of on the eastern edge of the temperate grassland. That grassland is called the Great Plains. We're on the western edge of the temperate deciduous forest, which is deciduous trees lose their leaves. So that extends through Ohio, Indiana, and eastern Illinois. And then finally, we can think about all these biomes as making up the biosphere. And the biosphere is the part of the earth that supports life. And here is a case where, again, our biology kind of limits our point of view. Obviously, the surface of the earth supports life. Obviously, the oceans support life. Those parts we can kind of agree with. You know, fish aren't people, but okay, there are living fish down at great depths in the ocean. What isn't as obvious because of our perspective is the biosphere actually extends about 2 miles, maybe 3 miles into the atmosphere, because there are some bacteria that are so small and so light that they float in the air. And they may float in the air for months at a time. So there are living organisms above the surface of the earth and even above the level where birds fly. And there are living organisms below the surface of the earth. I mean, this is pretty obvious. If you go in your backyard and you dig up a shovel full of dirt, you're probably going to see some earthworms. What you might not see, but what are there in large numbers are things like nematodes. You might find some insect larvae, some white worms, which are actually beetle larvae, are some maggots. You might find some fungi there, but there are bacteria that live up to about 2 miles underground. And they live in the minute cracks, the fissures in between rocks. And these are belong to one particular group of the archaebacteria that we talked about. But they live far underground. They don't, they're not very visible, and they haven't been discovered until relatively recently. But again, because they're not in an environment where we typically encounter them, we tend to not think of them when we think of living organisms in the biosphere. Now, notice if we look at the biosphere contains all the biomes. And the biomes contain all the ecosystems, and the ecosystems contain all the communities, and the communities contain all the populations, and the populations contain all the individual organisms. So one of the things we see as we look at higher and higher levels of ecology, and the biosphere is a higher level than the biome, when we look at the biosphere, we can see things that we can't see by looking at one single biome. If we look at an ecosystem, we can see things that we can't see in a community or a population or an individual organism. So the higher a level we look at, the broader a perspective we get. This broader perspective, these things that we can see at a high level that we can't see at a low level, these are something called emergent properties. And they can create a problem in science, because in science, we usually want to study things at the lowest level possible. So for instance, if we're studying global warming, we want to know what's happening at a chemical level. We'd like to know, how does carbon dioxide or methane, how do chemicals like this cause the temperature of the earth to increase? But the problem is, looking at that one chemical reaction, that doesn't tell you whether global warming is actually occurring or not. So for some problems, like for global warming, and the name gives you a big hint, global warming, the earth is a globe, we have to study the entire biosphere. And that means that this is a much more complicated problem than if we're just studying temperatures at a lower level. Because if we want to look at a biome, we could look at the Great Plains that I just mentioned, and we can see what's happening to average temperatures in the Great Plains. And the Great Plains cover parts of several states. But the problem is, the Great Plains could be getting warmer, they could be getting colder, and it doesn't necessarily show that global warming is happening or not happening. To study global warming, we have to look at temperatures around the entire Earth and how they're changing. And the problem with that, of course, is as you travel around the Earth, some places have better, I guess I would call them, meteorology departments than other places do. Some places, the records that we get about temperatures are not necessarily very reliable. So when we study something on a global level, like global warming, or most recently, we've been studying the COVID pandemic. Pandemic literally means that this is going around the world. These are the most difficult problems to study in ecology. And the reason they're most difficult to study is because they encompass such a wide area. We have to get accurate data from all over the place. You can't study global warming or the COVID pandemic by looking at Chicago or Cook County or the state of Illinois or Illinois plus Indiana or even the United States or North America. To study the COVID pandemic, you have to study the entire world. That's a lot more complicated than studying a population. If you want to study the population of greyhounds, that live in the United States, you can find out where all these dogs are located, and you could potentially study them. So one of the things we have to keep in mind is usually ecology is simpler to study if we're looking at an individual organism, if we're looking at you and all the living things that are in and on your body. Yeah, but as we get towards the biosphere level, this gets to be a more and more challenging study. So one of the things that we have to do from a practical standpoint, we really have to think about what level is best to study a problem on. You know, in many cases, we look at an ecosystem or a biome. We look at pollution in Lake Michigan. That would be looking at one particular ecosystem. Lake Michigan, you know, fish from the northern end can swim down towards the southern end. Fish from the southern end can swim up towards the northern end. So all the populations in Lake Michigan can potentially interact. But notice that's a very confined area of study compared to trying to look at the entire Earth. And unfortunately, it's led to biologists making some major mistakes when we study things like global warming. So as we start talking about those, we'll look at some of those mistakes. So are there any questions about kind of the basics of ecology before we start looking at populations? Okay, I'm going to stop sharing this screen. And we're going to talk just a little bit about populations before we leave for the day. So when we look at population ecology, you should be seeing kind of a map of the United States now, hopefully. If you don't see that, let me know. When we look at population ecology, populations are usually called the fundamental unit of ecology. And they're really the fundamental unit of evolution too. Remember all our focus on gene pools and Hardy-Weinberg. So when we study populations, we want to study two main factors about them. We want to find out where individuals in this population are found, their distribution. And we want to find out the number of individuals in the population and how the number is changing over periods of time. So when we study distribution, distribution can be thought of in two different ways. So one of the ways to think about distribution is through looking at something called the range. And the range describes basically the geographic area where a population or sometimes an entire species is found. So here's a map showing three different ranges for robins. And notice up in yellow towards the top, there's a range that robins use, and it's strictly for breeding. A little bit further south, this area in red, most of the 48 contiguous states, but notice it goes up into Vancouver and down into Mexico. This is where robins breed, but also where they winter. And then finally, there are some areas down in Florida and the very tip of Louisiana and Baja California and Mexico, where robins winter, where they migrate south and spend some time, but they're not shown as breeding in these kind of green areas. So that means that when spring comes and it's time to breed, they fly back north to either this red region or this yellow region. So this is the range. Now, the usefulness of knowing the range of an animal is limited. And the reason it's limited is, you know, think about robins and Illinois. Robins are basically shown over all of Illinois, but they're found in certain specific types of environments. We don't usually find robins in forests or woods. Robins are found in areas that are basically open. They may have a tree here and there. That's where robins like to build their nest. But robins basically live in areas that are grasslands. That's one of the reasons that we see a lot of them in cities. They build their nest in a tree, and they stake out a territory, and that territory is basically your front yard, maybe your neighbors too. So the range gives us the very general area, but it doesn't tell us specifically where they're found. A good way to think about this problem is to look at something else. The red here represents the range of an organism called channel catfish. And channel catfish basically live in kind of deep streams and bigger streams that we call rivers, and some lakes. And if we look here, right in this area, right here is Illinois. And up above us, this is the Great Lakes. Channel catfish are found in Illinois. But if I walk out in my front yard or my backyard, no channel catfish, despite the fact that they're found in Illinois. Well, why? Because they're catfish. They live in the water. They live in streams and rivers and sometimes lakes. I don't have a moat going around my house. You know, I thought about it when Game of Thrones was on, but changed my mind. So since I don't have water, we're not going to find channel catfish there. Now, it might be obvious with fish that, well, of course, they're only going to be found in water. But some fish have very specific habitat requirements. There are some fish called minnows, and there's one type of minnow called stone roller minnows. And minnows, stone roller minnows, mostly live in streams where the current is relatively fast. If the current is very slow and sluggish, they don't live in that part of the stream. So it's not always obvious exactly where an organism lives. If we want a more specific example of where an organism lives, we're talking about something called habitat. Habitat is the specific location within their range where animals live. So for stone roller minnows, their range would look pretty similar actually to the channel catfish. But their habitat, we wouldn't be able to show. It would be a lot of little red dots here and there, because those dots would be focused on areas where there are streams, and in particular, streams that have relatively fast currents. So the habitat is usually a verbal description of where an organism lives. There's one type of bird that lives in this area called the red-winged blackbird. But again, the red-winged blackbird is kind of found everywhere east of the Rocky Mountains. That's its range. But if we look at red-winged blackbirds, they tend to live on tall vegetation that grows around ponds. Things like cattails are some of the tall grasses that grow around the edges of the pond, kind of half in the water, half out of the water. So that's their habitat. So if you would walk around the South Suburban campus, on the south side of campus, there's a pond. And about this time of the year, we can usually find some red-winged blackbirds living in the cattails there. Now you might spot them out around campus flying around to collect food, but their nests are down in the cattails. And if you look for the nest of a red-winged blackbird and you look for it out in a meadow, you won't find it. Even though Illinois is part of their range, that's not the habitat that they live in. So the habitat that they live in is much, much more specific. And that's usually more valuable from an ecological standpoint. Okay, I think we're going to stop here for today. So are there any questions before we leave? If not, I will let you go and we will see each other again on Wednesday morning, I suppose.
Have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Have a good day.
You too. Did you get my email, Corey?
I need to go check.
Okay. Yeah. I just wanted to
Okay,
make sure you'd seen it.
Okay. I miss Game of Thrones.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.